During the summer of 2010, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society released a new brochure at their conventions titled The Origin of Life: 5 Questions Worth Asking. It attempts to convince readers that what the Bible says is scientifically accurate, primarily by debunking evolution. On page 3, the brochure advises Christians to use their power of reason and to prove to themselves the things they are taught. Let's follow this advice and take a closer look at the brochure. On page 4, addressing the question, "How did life begin?" we can get a feel for the brochure's fair and balanced approach to the topic of the origin of life. It says, "Many who believe in evolution would tell you that billions of years ago, life began on the edge of an ancient tidal pool or deep in the ocean. They feel that in some such location, chemicals spontaneously assembled into bubble-like structures, formed complex molecules, and began replicating. They believe that all life on Earth originated by accident from one or more of these simple original cells." Notice, it doesn't say that scientists have discovered or learned anything. It says that they feel and they believe, as if scientists just sit around all day discussing their feelings. Sorry, that's what religious folks do. The same page says that just as many parents feel awkward about discussing where babies come from, some scientists seem reluctant to discuss an even more fundamental question: where did life come from? This is an ad hominem attack, attempting to dilute respect for scientists by asserting, without any substantiation, that some scientists seem reluctant to discuss the origin of life. Which ones? Why are they reluctant? We don't know. And while we're on the subject, why do some parents feel awkward about discussing where babies come from? Likely because they grew up in a stultifying religious atmosphere that taught them that sex and the human body are sinful and dirty. More humorously, on page 5, the brochure's authors state, "Life always comes from pre-existing life. However, if we go back far enough in time, is it really possible that this fundamental law was broken?" On page 7, they sum up their argument by stating, "All scientific evidence to date indicates that life can come only from previously existing life." They claim that believing otherwise requires a huge leap of faith. This is a funny argument for the Watchtower Society to make, as they claim to follow Hebrews 3:4, wherein we read that God created everything. But wait, where did God come from? I mean, since the Society claims life can only come from pre-existing life, surely someone created God. Of course, you might disagree with this, but then according to the Watchtower Society, you're making a huge leap of faith. On the same page, they likewise ask, what is the scientific basis for saying that the first cell sprang from non-living chemicals? That's a great question, but perhaps a better one would be, what is more likely to have sprang from non-living chemicals, a cell or an omnipotent, omniscient God? Another smokescreen is thrown up on page 9. Paragraph 3 begins by asserting, if the theory of evolution is true, it should offer a plausible explanation of how the first simple cell formed by chance. This is silly. Evolution merely describes the change found in inherited traits of a population of organisms. The Watchtower Society might as easily state, if the theory of gravity is true, it should offer a plausible explanation of how the first simple cell formed by chance. At any rate, pointing out incomplete areas of a theory simply indicates the need for further research. It does not indicate we should throw up our hands and say, oh well, a God must have done it. They continue with smokescreen questioning on page 12. Some evolutionary scientists would like to make a distinction between the theory of evolution and the question of the origin of life. But does that sound reasonable to you? Again, this is like asking, some scientists say there's a difference between electricity and magnetism, but does that sound reasonable to you? Another loaded statement occurs on page 21. Scientists cannot create DNA with all its replication and transcription machinery, nor can they fully understand it. Yet some assert that they know that it all came about by undirected chance and accidents. Again, this is silly. Scientists, like most people, simply accept the facts as they are uncovered. Even still, it is reasonable to claim to know things even if we don't fully understand them. For example, I am incapable of creating a car, nor do I fully understand how they work. Yet I assert that I know that they were made in factories and that one will get me to work tomorrow. And notice they use the word chance. They use it a lot. In his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins responds to the Watchtower Society's use of the word chance. He says, it's simply wrong. Evolution's main driving force, natural selection, is the opposite of chance, as it implies the strongest, most fit members of a population will survive to reproduce, thereby passing their stronger traits onto their descendants. They end page 21 by asking if, when observing a computer room, it is more reasonable to conclude that the machinery made itself or that they were produced by orderly minds. This is the ultimate joke, as no scientist claims that humans or any animal sprang forth fully formed by themselves. Rather, it is religions, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, that make such a claim about their gods. Of course, the Watchtower Society doesn't expect us to simply accept their line of reasoning. They also appeal to authority by quoting from several reputable sources. For example, on page 24, they quote evolutionary biologist Henry G. by stating, "The intervals of time that separate the fossils are so huge that we cannot say anything definite about their possible connection through ancestry and descent." But here's a problem. G wasn't talking about the time spans between fossils in general. He was simply giving an illustration of how difficult it would be to link an ancestor of a giant civet fossil that was 1,000,000 years older than another giant civet fossil. Meanwhile, on page 6, they quote from Professor Carol Cleland. Regarding the theories of life arising by chance, the brochure quotes Cleland as saying, "None of them have provided us with a very satisfying story about how this happened." But when reached for a comment, Professor Cleland told the creators of this video, "I never said this. It is clear that scientists know how many of the most basic building blocks of life are made under natural conditions." She added, "My work has been used before by these people, and it really angers me because they are using it to defend views that I reject. It is deeply dishonest for theists to deliberately distort the words of scholars for their own purposes. As I recall, this is a sin." And here's another funny thing. The brochure's authors can't seem to find a single scientist who believes in the Bible's tale of creation. On page after page they mention, in asides and footnotes, that the person being quoted is not a creationist and does not mean to suggest that evolution is wrong. Really? Is there no reputable source to quote from that accepts the Genesis account? On page 30, the brochure asks, "In the course of reading this brochure, were you surprised to learn that what the Bible says is scientifically accurate?" Actually, I was surprised to learn that such a question could even be asked. Up to this point, the brochure had only quoted from the Bible 6 times. Twice to point out that it's important to consider our steps and use our power of reason. Once to point out that God created everything. Once to note that there are a lot of life forms. Once to claim that God has X-ray vision. And once to state that life forms only reproduce according to their kinds. This final quote is the only one that offers any intriguing scientific claim. But unfortunately, the Watchtower Society immediately renders it useless by not defining kind. Actually, though, the Watchtower Society does define the word kind, though we must go to a different publication for this definition. In their book, Reasoning from the Scriptures, on page 87, they state, "All interfertile varieties of any animal are just one Genesis kind." But this is an odd claim to make, since they also assert that only 43 kinds of mammals were on board Noah's Ark in the year 2370 BC, and that these mammals are responsible for all present terrestrial mammalian life. Since conservative estimates place the number of present mammal kinds at 4,000, this means that Jehovah's Witnesses must accept that the number of mammal species has increased from 43 to 4,000 during the last 4,380 years. This means that while, on the one hand, Jehovah's Witnesses categorically reject evolution, they simultaneously subscribe to the notion that since the flood, mammals have evolved at a rate some 16,000 times more rapidly than is taught in traditional science textbooks. The brochure asks, "More than a few educated people take a dim view of the Bible. Can you understand why?" Thanks to this brochure, we can.